Hello and welcome to another episode of Django Chat. In this episode, we're going to talk about deployment, the things you need to do to change your Django application and options for putting your site online. As ever, I'm joined by Carlton Gibson. Hi, Carlton.
Hello, Will. How are you?
I am good. So this is one of the top questions that I get as a Django educator, and it really is confusing the first time or several times you go through it. So there's a long list of things that are different on local Django versus deployment Django. As a Django fellow, perhaps you could talk about why Django makes some of the choices they use, such as SQLite and all the rest, to make local development easier.
Well, SQLite or SQLite, SQL was a separate programming language back to the day, so surely it's called SQL rather than SQL, so we'll call it SQLite. I don't know. Anyway, SQLite, why? Because it comes embedded in Python, and you can just get up and running, and you don't have to set up a different server. And so when you do start project and start app, and you can run server, you're up and running with SQLite. SQLite, I just said SQL. Who knows what it's called?
Just pick one, yeah.
Yeah. You're up with SQLite without any extra work. And when you're first starting, the last thing you need is install Postgres.
Yeah, it's hard. It's quite hard to set up Postgres or another one on a server, especially if you're not using Docker. And yeah, whereas SQLite is file based, so it's just that little file right there, and boop, away you go. So let's go through. There's a list of things, and we'll go through maybe and talk about the choices Django has made. But first, we should mention there is a deployment checklist in the fantastic docs, which we'll link to, and you can run a command, manage.py check -- deploy, which will, in an automated way, say, hey, you forgot some of these like must-haves, because there's a bunch of nice-to-haves depending on your project, but there's a bunch of must-haves of which switching over from SQLite is, in most cases, one of them.
Yeah, and to run that deployment check is handy.
Yeah, no, but I say that because I wasn't aware of that page in the docs for a long time. So
yeah, so the two things: the checklist, which is a page in the docs, and then the check command with the deploy flag, which is like automated. So normally when you migrate, the checks get run, but to make sure you haven't misconfigured an admin or misconfigured a model. But these extra deployment only checks, you have to actually enable the flag and run the command.
Yes, need the flag. So let's go through the list. So number one is probably debug. So in the settings.py file, by default, debug is turned to true, which gives all sorts of nice debugging and other error collection. But you do not want to have that on for production. You want to change that to false, because that means that anyone out there in the great wide web can see things you don't want them to see about your project, and it will be insecure. So that is probably number one. If you had to pick only one thing, is switch debug to false.
Yeah, and the error page that Django throws up shows your whole environment.
It's everything. It's everything.
So you can't have that visible.
But I mean, how you configure that, there's multiple ways to automatically toggle debug. I mean, you can do it with different settings files. You can do it with environment variables. I'm curious, do you have a personal preference for how to do it? Because it's actually a little bit tricky configuring it so it automatically knows, I'm in local, change debug, and when I'm in production, change it to something else.
Oh, I'm almost scared to say what my personal preference is.
Yeah, you're a bit of a what's the kind word?
Stalinist. No, okay,
I'll say many people are probably aware of the 2 Scoops of Django book, which came out a couple years ago, which advocated multiple settings files. So you'd have a base settings file, and then a local settings file and deployment settings file, which would override. And so you would sort of chain them together and run a different set of settings files depending upon which environment you are in. That's the standard pattern people are aware of.
And to be honest, that's what I use on quite a number of my projects.
Yeah, and it works. There's nothing wrong with that. I have been using Docker a lot recently, and with Docker, you can use environment variables, which is 12-factor auth type of deal. And so there you can also override, but basically you can have a single settings file, and then you can override your environment variables.
Yeah, and if I was starting fresh today, that's probably the way I would do it.
Yeah, I think it's simpler if you've never done it before. Use environment variables. Don't do the settings pattern, but the settings pattern is fine too. But it is quite confusing. I mean, I've just finished the chapter on this in my book, Django for Professionals. And I've talked to quite a few experts about, I mean, I could do a whole episode on just environment variables within Docker. So it's...
And it's not just in Docker, it's in your local development environment. It's how do you set environment variables sensibly, and think crazy things like, because of the way the Unix programming environment is, settings, environment variables arrive in your process as strings, even though they might be integers. You might want them as integers, so you need some kind of help to cast them to the right type, or you need to be aware that they're going to come in as strings. Environment variables are kind of complicated. And
they are.
I think at a first level, multiple setting files can actually be easy. So you've got your base ones, which are the same in every environment, and then you've got your local ones where you've got, you have, your local database set, and then you've got your production settings, which have your production database settings plus this debug equals false.
Yeah. Well, and with the Docker-based environment variable setup, you have your default, which is basically your local, and then you have a single settings file, you have a single environment variable file, like a .env, and then you have a .prod.env, which just overwrites those. So it's actually it's 2 files instead of 3, the way you would have with settings, but it's the same idea. You want to automate it.
So one way people handle environment variables is to put them in an M file of some kind. So this is a file that has key pairs between the environment variable name and environment variable value, and somehow you get that into your environment when launching your process. And there are all sorts of tricks about that. But if you're going to have multiple environments, you're going to end up with one of these M files for each of those. And well, how is this any different from multiple settings files? It's there's no free lunch here, right?
No, and you can also just hard code your environment variables into your Docker Compose file with Docker. Though I think generally speaking, a better practice is to create a .m file, because then you can ignore that file, so it's not in your source control. So your
so the whole point about this is
which
to
is the whole point,
secret, right? The whole thing is, otherwise you put things like your secret key or your database password or whatever into your source key, control, and you don't want to do that. And so
but so what we just discussed is a shorter variation of the conversations I've been having with other experts. So you need some way to toggle between local and production. It is complicated. You can do the settings file approach. You can do the environment variable approach. Pick one. Try not to spend too much time on it would be my advice. But it is tricky. And that leads us to probably the second thing that you would want to change, or at least make truly secret when you're going to production, which is your secret key. So this is 50? I think it's 50 character string. That's something like that. That's automatically generated. When you do start project command, you've probably checked it into source control. You can actually, I'll do a link to it. You can use the internal Django to do on the command line to generate a new random secret key, which you might want to do, and then link to that through an environment variable. But that's something that it says in the settings files, but you really want your secret key to be secret, because it's used for all the hashing of all the other secret stuff within Django.
No, but everything. If you've got a sign-in link, then it will be hash used with the Django secrets, and that will be use the secret key to generate the hash, the session identifiers, everything, absolutely everything.
So how do you keep your secret, since you're using settings files? Secret.
Okay, so exactly this. So for a production environment, you have one which is outside of source control, and normally I would keep that in a .m file, and then if I have in a supervisor or in whatever process manager I'm using, load that into the environment when calling the Django process.
Yeah,
and that works with Ansible as well. And, ideally you can store these things in some sort of vault.
Yeah, like a password manager or somewhere safe.
Well, the password manager for small teams, but then when you're deploying it, all the major cloud providers will provide a secret keeper place where you can put a secret in, and you can only fetch it back out with the right key, and it'll give you that value, but it's not readable by anybody ever. HashiCorp have got one called Vault, and then Microsoft Azure's got one, and Google have got one, and Amazon have got one as well. I can never remember the names of all the services, but they're a nice place where you can put those, and they're online, they're shareable with a team, and then you can have your process access those on demand.
Right. Because this is another key aspect. If you're in a team setting, you might want everyone to have access to the code base, but you don't want everyone to have access to your Stripe API key, for example.
Or your production database password.
Or production. Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Some horror stories I could tell about that. So if also one thing to mention, there is a fantastic third-party package, Django Environ, which I haven't found a use case for it within Docker, but in standard non-Docker environments, it packages up a bunch of other tools, and it's a really great way to do 12-factor auth with environment variables. So we'll link to that. Number 3, I would say, so debug, secret key, allowed hosts. Do you want to explain what allowed hosts are?
Okay, so you don't want your Django app for myprettywebsite.com to respond to requests for someone else's evilwebsite.com. So allowed hosts is a list of exactly allowed hosts. You might respond to myprettywebsite.com as well as myfriendsprettywebsite.com. You might respond to those two, but nothing else. And so you put those into allowed hosts, and then Django will reject any settings, any requests for hosts which aren't matched. And that's not. There are ways of spoofing the host header and other such things, but that's a nice base level check. It says, no, I'm not going to respond to requests for the wrong website.
Right. And the default, if you look in your settings.py file, it is just empty. Oh, it looks empty, but really it's set to localhost and 127.0.0.8000.
If debug is true.
What's that?
If debug is true.
If debug is true. Correct.
Yeah.
Right. So you will have to set allowed hosts, whatever your deployment, whether it's Heroku, all the rest, you'll have to put that in there. So
yes, and your web app won't start. But this is the error you get is from the checks. You remember earlier on we talked about the check framework where you run manage.py check. That's automatically run, and that allowed host check is run every time. And if debug is false, then it will check that you set allowed host correctly.
Yeah,
and that's independent of the extra checks which the deploy flag.
Nice. Django has these batteries. Thoughtful people smarter than me have gone through this before.
Yeah, and like for instance, like setting the right header values and things on cookies and stuff that you and I and everybody else, we don't know, but somebody has thought about it and they've put the time in and they've made sure that you've configured it right, and they tell you if you don't, and that's
it's quite nice. So let's see, what would be number 4? I would say static file stuff. So this would be images, CSS, JavaScript. There's actually Jacob Kaplan-Moss will link to this, gave a fantastic talk at PyCon on it's called Assets in Django Without Losing Your Hair. And basically you need to in Django, what our assets are called static for legacy reasons, and then there's often media, which refers to user uploaded content. So so a static asset would be an image, but you could also, if it was coming from users, you would put it into a media. And his talk kind of goes into this, but the reason why there's a distinction is because you don't trust your users. You shouldn't. So you want to put that information not on your server. And then when you reach a certain size, you probably want to take all those assets and not have them on your server either, even the ones you've created, and put them in a CDN, like S3 or CloudFront, something like that. But one thing that I took away from that talk is you can scale pretty far actually with keeping assets on your local server. Actually, the numbers he gave were much higher than I expected, because I've always, I guess, prematurely optimized and gone right to S3 CloudFront. But he, and maybe your experience is the same, said, you can go pretty far with not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, let's say standard setup, a single virtual machine running Nginx with a Django application behind it, perhaps with Gunicorn in front of it, or Green Unicorn we call it, but Gunicorn. If you've configured Nginx to serve your static files directly from the file system, and especially if you set the right headers, the right response headers, so that those requests are cached, because they're static, they don't change. You can set long-lived headers. Actually,
right.
That instance, that really basic one server instance, can serve a lot of traffic.
Don't do it unless you need to. And then there's the 4th level is Webpack and Parcel and all these things, for her packaging your JavaScript, which if you can avoid.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Yeah, it depends. Again, it's like if you're shipping a small Django app yourself, then keep it simple. Don't get into all of that stuff. If you're part of a bigger team, you need all of that. You need that front end because that's what the front end team will give you, but you need to bundle it up. Then you need to put it somewhere where your web server can find it, be that on a CDN or be that on your single web server. But you'd be amazed how much you can get a small instance to serve if you do the right things.
Yes. Two more points I have anyways on a quick list. So one is, the database. So we mentioned you need to decide on your production database. And generally speaking, you don't want SQLite right now. Built-in support for PostgreSQL, MySQL, and Oracle, though Oracle may not be there for that long. So
no, I think, I don't know if it's going
No?
anywhere. No.
Okay.
I think we're keeping it. MariaDB is coming along too, I think.
Oh, okay. Maybe, well, I'll edit out the Oracle slang then, the slag then.
No. Let's slag off Oracle.
Do you? So for me, I've almost predominantly worked with Postgres. I feel like if you need advice, that's probably the advice you will hear in the Django community. But if you're asking for advice, you also don't really know what you're doing. So they're kind of all the same at the beginner level.
Yeah, I mean, so when I started, it was all MySQL. It was just that was the database, and so for 4 or 5 years, I was running MySQL all the time. And then Postgres came along, and particularly with when Django brought in the contrib.postgres, the extra fields like the JSON field, the array field, the HStore stuff. There's range fields in there now. There's case insensitive text fields. There's all kind of extra stuff which Postgres gave you, as well as the GeoDjango stuff, which works kind of better on Postgres or PostGIS. Ended up moving over to Postgres, and for a number of years now, that's been my sort of go-to option. I'm a big fan of...
And there's full-text search as well that
Yes.
Django has integrated that Postgres has had for a while.
Yeah, I'm increasingly coming back towards SQLite for a lot of use cases if they're read-heavy and things like this. I'm just a really closet fan, and not a closet fan, I wear it proudly on my sleeve. I'm a big fan of SQLite.
Yeah.
But yeah, Postgres is perhaps the beginning place to go in the Django community at this time. Adam Johnson, I'm really hoping to get on. He maintains a package called Django Mysql, which brings a lot of the features that are similar to Contrib Postgres for MySQL, and he'll come and tell us why you should use that or MariaDB, which is the open source equivalent or the free software equivalent of MySQL, because some Microsoft... Sun owned MySQL and Oracle bought Sun, and so with it, MySQL is owned by the Oracle brand. So MariaDB is the free software offshoot of that.
I think Oracle owns Java now, right? Or Sun or one of those, so that's partly why Java is...
So when Oracle bought Sun, they got Java and MySQL as for the package.
Good way to kill an open source community. Well, last big one I would say is the admin. There's multiple ways to what's called harden it. Probably the biggest one is you should not run. You should change the URL for your admin. You can go into your top level URLs file and do this. Just make it anything other than admin, because if you were a malicious actor, you could write a script that says, "Hey, whatever site/admin would be a Django site." And I will just try to brute force my way into the admin and cause all sorts of harm.
Yeah, and if you run any web server ever and you just look at the access logs for that, you will see regularly, like every hour, you will see request after request for known URLs. So most of those are WordPress URLs, but also Django URLs appear in those. And these are people running automated penetration kits, automated scripts, which... find a server, attack a server, and find if it's got weaknesses. So if by renaming your admin, you can avoid most of those attacks for Django, because it's not that your admin is any more secure, it's that the automated scripts don't hit it.
Yeah, well, I remember the first time I set up I think it was a DigitalOcean server, and I didn't know what I was doing, and whatever, I forget the lockdown steps you're supposed to take, within 90 minutes, basically bots had taken over, and I got a notice from DigitalOcean saying like your machine server is doing malicious things. So it's a scary place out there in the internet, especially if you're rolling your own server stuff.
Yeah, and the key point is that these attacks aren't somebody picking you out. They are fully
it's not
automated.
Personal. Yeah, it's not personal
fully
at all.
automated. And so it's not if there is a vulnerability which your site exposes, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Yeah. And so definitely change the admin URL. There's actually Lacey Williams and Jeff Triplett have written an article on hardening your admin, which we will link to. So that's the basic stuff. So it sounds like a lot. In practice, you will write scripts or you'll get used to doing this for your Django sites. But the top ones are you got to switch debug, keep your secret key secret, allowed hosts you'll need to put in wherever it is in production. Static files, you'll need to think about that. You need to choose a production database, and you should do some basic steps around the admin. And in addition to the check, there's also Pony Checkup, I believe is still the site that's run by
Sasha Roman.
Sasha, yeah, you can put in the URL for your site, and it will run a bunch of automated tests to see if it's secure. So that's a good, I always do that after I've gone through all these things, just as like a triple check. But there's also, within Django, there's a couple commands that maybe, do you want to cover, Carlton? So migrate, collect static.
Right. Okay. So for me, right, there's a 1, 2, 3 of deployment, which you've got to do every single time. So the first one is upload your code. You've got to get it onto the server somehow. Yeah. Now, back in the day, that's rsync and a can of beer is the joke about deploying PHP sites. But you can, what can you do? I don't know. You can clone your repository on the server, and you can git pull onto the server, which is not a bad way, as long as you don't mess around on there and get your checkout messed up by getting.
I think most people, most companies, I think, do it this way. They put it up on GitHub or wherever, and then pull from there. I think that's the standard approach,
and that's quite cool. You can extract some kind of zip archive. You can even set up a PyPI clone and set up tools, publish it to there. But that's
I mean, with like Heroku, you push the code, so you do like instead of git push origin, you do git push Heroku origin. So literally the two-step is you push it to GitHub or Bitbucket or wherever, and then separately you push it up to Heroku, and then it will automatically go through all the steps for each time you push new code to it.
Yeah, and the Azure App Service has a similar thing where you can do a push from your local commit, and I think they can also pull on, they can watch a GitHub branch as well. Some of these services do that, where when you push to the GitHub branch, it automatically pulls on the server. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, but this is but just sorry to interrupt, but so a big thing for beginners is they'll say, well, I wrote a local blog, Django blog, and I put 10 entries in there, and then I put it up on my platform as service, and I don't see it. What up with that?
Yes.
And that's because it makes a ton of sense. It's because it just takes a while to understand that your local database is not your production database. It shouldn't be. You kind of get this drilled into you with practice, but that's why. Your local and your production environments are different, but it is confusing, and it takes a while for people to internalize that. And I don't know if you have anything to add on that, but I see people do that again and again and again. And I certainly went through that process myself, saying like, my site looks how I want it to look. Why doesn't it look like that in production? It's like, well.
Okay, so the thing you can do here is you can set your, you can create a settings file so you're not connecting to a local database, that you're actually connecting to your remote database. So assuming that your local IP address is allowing you, or you can SSH tunnel into wherever your production database is, you can set your local install to connect to your production database if you want to. When you're creating a small blog like this kind of works. So locally you're developing on the code, but you're still, when you write a blog post locally, it still goes into your production database. And importantly as well, your media files. So you create a blog post and you upload an image, and that gets saved to your local media file, not to the one on your web server. And it's like, where's it gone, and how do I sync these things? It's one thing you can do as well is, if it's read heavy, you can use SQLite, and you can just upload. You can
if it's just a read
file into place. And when you want to work locally, you can just download it, and then you can work on that, and then you can upload it to replace it. That's kind of poor man's sync It does work.
So all right, so migrate. The second command is
okay. So the first one is upload code, right? And then the second one is you've got to migrate your database. And so if you've got a hosted, you've run RDS and you've got a hosted Postgres instance, and you've created some changes, you've tested them locally, you've put your code up there. Now you've got to run migrate. And so you need to do that on your server that's connecting to your production database. Or again, you can connect locally to production
Yeah,
database.
and again, you'll
run it
say,
in your
I
local
ran it
shell.
locally. Like, what's going on in production?
Yeah, you've got to migrate your production database. And then the third one is collect static, where you put all the static files from your project somewhere where your web server knows how to find them.
Yeah, and Jacob talks about this, but yeah, the collect static command, which is automatically run on Heroku, and I assume other platforms, takes all the static files from all over your app, puts them into one nice place for Django to refer to. That's another thing that takes some time to internalize how static files work within Django.
Yeah, but there's a great guide, and you've just got to take your time, and like all these things.
Yeah, the docs are clear once you know what you like. That's what I always find. Like once I understand something, I go read the docs. I'm like, oh, like they make so much sense. Like I would have written them this way. But when you are learning it and when you are frustrated, it's like these half truths, and you're like, ah. So it's not the doc's fault, but that is the reality of Django beginner.
Yeah, it's like what we talked about in the How to Learn Django episode. It's like there's the docs, which are kind of like reference material, versus the tutorial you need, the walkthrough to get you there first time.
This is like my meta understanding at this point in my career is that tutorials and documentation are different things, and should be, and always will be. But often you want the tutorial when you're learning, not the docs.
Entirely.
Which is what I'm working on. So, and others. So don't worry about it. We'll cover the bases. Actually, for image stuff, I wrote a recent tutorial on how to do image uploading or file uploading within Django that covers some of the basics on static and media files that we'll link to. It gives you
and often the hardest thing here is if you're configuring on a web server, is to configure the right directory permissions and make sure that your Django process can write to the folder and your web server can read from it. And
that's the last thing we should cover. So where to deploy? So one way you were just saying is a virtual machine where Linode, DigitalOcean, I'm sure there's others we're forgetting, but they all of the cloud servers offer pretty much all of these things as far as I can tell. They all seem to offer what I'd call a hosted runtime or a platform as a service, where you just push your app code and it runs it for you and you don't have to worry about it. They all seem to offer a virtual machine solution where you can provision a virtual machine. It's like having Ubuntu server there, and you have to install the right software and you run your thing. But again, you can get images, like base images, which you provision from that one, and it's already got the right Python installed, and then you just have to pip install, Django or your project requirements, and you create a virtual environment, pip install your requirements, and run it, and it works. Because that base image has all the things you need to run a Django project on it. And then they all now seem to offer a container runtime where you can push a Docker
container. Yep. And so, it doesn't really matter which hosting provider, I think.
They're all challenging and confusing. I mean, I've only done it with a couple of them. I understand in the abstract how it is done. I could figure out how to do it in all the others, but realistically speaking, you just sort of pick one. If a beginner asks me, I would say do not go anywhere near a virtual machine. You should do it as a learning exercise, but just use a platform as a service. Use Docker, Azure, Python Anywhere. Just get it up there. The trap of virtual machines I found is that it feels like real engineering because it is. DevOps is like a whole separate profession, and like it's like getting gnarly, and you get in there and you fix things, but it's just endless. And your end users do not care where your site was hosted; they just want it to work and be up. And so, unless you are at significant scale, in which case you shouldn't be the only developer, I would say don't go anywhere near this stuff, except for learning exercise that's worth doing. Or if you know what you're doing, you've automated scripts, which I suspect is kind of where you're at, Carlton.
Yeah, and this is what I was going to say. So you pick one and you learn it, right?
Yeah.
And then you make sure that your deployment to that is scriptable. So tools here like Fabric or Ansible, and Ansible's the big sort of name, and that's built in Python.
Yeah.
But you've got a deployment script. So when you run, my project deploy, Ansible playbook deploy, blah, it uploads your code. It does the git pull or whatever on the server in the right place. It migrates the database. It collects static. It runs, the deployment checks that you want to do. It reboots your process managers that restarts your Django application. All these kind of things. It refreshes your SSH certificate from Let's Encrypt. Script all of these bits. And then you can start to think, oh, I've got this running on App Engine. I could easily get this going on, this app service over here, or this Elastic Beanstalk over here by just changing a few bits of the script. And then all of a sudden, instead of being able to do it in one, you can do it in three. And then you think, oh, I could do this with a virtual machine. And I can provision a virtual machine. And you slowly increase the...
Yeah, you slide down into more and more control.
And it depends what value that has to you, right?
Yeah, that's the key thing.
Tom Dyson said on the Wagtail episode that, we were talking about the price, or did he say it, or was it in the after chat? I don't know, but he was saying that, actually the platforms of the service, they're really quite affordable, until you scale up quite high, because the time you take configuring a virtual machine or whatever it's like, oh, it'd be much cheaper if I did it on this micro instance that only costs X dollars a month. Yeah, but you're not counting your hourly rate that it took to get that micro instance in a position where it could serve those requests.
Exactly. I mean, I've wasted weeks and weeks and weeks of my time on solo projects or early stage startups fiddling around with virtual machines when thinking exactly that, thinking, oh well, I'm saving $50 a month versus this platform as service. Meanwhile, 2 weeks of my life have gone away. So
yeah, and that could have been 2 weeks of your life writing copy or writing user interface code, which actually users are going to see one day.
So it is fun to learn how to do this stuff and it is interesting, but value your time, and I would say be very specific about this as a learning exercise. Unless you're in a big company, and then you get paid to figure this stuff out.
Unless your focus is down towards that DevOps stuff.
Yeah,
because there are different ways you can go. You might be more interested in that back end system admin DevOps stuff. In which case, learn it, because you ain't going to get the roles that you want without that experience. But if it's not your specialty, if it's not your what they call the area of genius, then head somewhere else.
Oh, area of genius! I like that.
Yeah, my wife told me about it. She read some books, so I'll have to find out what the book was.
Oh, okay. That's such a nice way to phrase it. Yeah, well, and I know that I am not a DevOps person. I am a very product-focused engineer, if that's a term. I kind of veer more toward, even though I spend all this time on Django, I veer much more towards the front end, and I just want it to work and talk to users and get feedback.
Right, but if you imagine a continuum, right?
Yeah.
Where like at the top end you've got, doing the graphic design for the buttons in the UI, that kind of stuff. And at the bottom end you've got the configuring the network layer for your Kubernetes cluster. Like Django's sort of up the front end side of it, even though it is a back end framework.
Yeah,
right?
It is.
There's so much gnarly stuff below to be able to serve requests. The Django's actually front end.
Yeah,
there you are. That's the title for the podcast. Django's front end.
Django's front end. And I think, in terms of just a side note on career advice, because I get emailed for career advice all the time, which is kind of hilarious to me. But I would say that it is probably much more marketable to have a strong back-end knowledge, though it narrows down the number of companies you can work at because not that many companies are at scale. However, you can spend 5-10 years, learning how to do all these things it's really hard to learn otherwise. Whereas, CSS or JavaScript, you can do that on your own a little bit.
Yeah, but you can also spend 5 or 10 years learning that stuff, which...
Oh, you can and should. I'm just saying maybe this is... the bias that I see is that people respect 10 years of back-end experience more than 10 years of front-end experience. And maybe that's just picking the wrong clients, but...
No, there is that bias. I think it's totally misplaced because somebody who really knows CSS is absolutely invaluable, and it's just as much a skill, and it's just, great experiences can't be crafted without it.
Yeah. Even the most hardcore, lives in the command line engineer, when they see a site, they can say that's an ugly site, and they will implicitly judge it in some way. So anyways, all right, I think we covered it. It's a complicated topic. I've been spending months and months trying to figure out how to simplify this for my new book. So I understand the pain of all this. But the takeaway is you should check the deployment checklist. You should be aware of the check flag and pick a platform as a service if you're just starting out. Get it running, and then be aware that there are all these other levels. And it is really fun and interesting to learn all this stuff, but it's deep.
Yeah, and be on the first hand, be prepared to take the time because it is deep and you need to get it right. But on the second hand, be conscious of, hey, am I going down a rabbit hole that I don't really need to here?
Yeah, don't spend 2 weeks on...
think seriously, what's my career? What's my project? Is this a benefit to me?
Yes. Great.
Anyway, that's about all we've got to say about deployment, I think. So
Yeah. So we will see you next week, Carlton. I'll talk to you then.
all right, take care. Bye bye.
Bye.